empirical or statistical model relating those right-hand side variables to prices on the left-hand side, it turns out to be easier to just linearize things. Whether or not that like leads you to incorrect conclusions will basically depend on how nonlinear that function f we wrote up actually is. So the same methodology, the same hedonic pricing methodology, as I mentioned earlier, can also be used when looking at occupational choices. So one example would be thinking about like driving a truck in Afghanistan versus driving a truck in the United States, or driving a truck in like Iraq versus driving a truck in the United States. So I mean, we've basically exited Iraq now. We're kind of winding down Afghanistan, the war there. But certainly, at least while those wars were ongoing, there was a lot of, so instead of the military having its own personnel driving trucks around, supplying supplying armed forces, there was a lot of hiring of basically private contractors to drive trucks around. And as you might expect, basically, in order to pay somebody, say, in the United States to go over and drive a truck in Afghanistan or in Iraq, you need to really increase the salary because you're compensating them for substantial risk as well as other sort of negative attributes about that job. So the former, somebody who's, say, driving it in the middle of the war zone could easily make 6 figures, whereas the latter, somebody just driving a truck around the United States, might only make like $40,000 per year. And so the primary difference between those two jobs, I mean, in both cases, you're just driving a truck around. Presumably, the roads in the U.S. are somewhat better than the roads in Iraq, but that's probably not going to be the main difference in terms of the disutility that somebody might apply to the former job versus the latter. The primary difference is going to be increased risk, also to a substantial extent inconvenient location, since you're going to have to be away from your friends and family for a while. And so the fact that there's two differences does make it harder to like determine exactly how much of the premium to truck driving in Afghanistan is due to like the increased risk of the job versus how much is due to the inconvenient location. But in principle, we might use this variation in risk to estimate drivers' willingness to accept to face this increased risk, right? So basically, this is a case where we're not thinking about willingness to pay. This is a case where we're thinking about willingness to accept because you basically have the right to not go and drive a truck in Afghanistan if you don't want to. And so in order to induce you to do that, we're going to need to pay you. And so what we're measuring here is how much we need to pay you, like how much you are willing to accept in order to take on this additional risk. And this is something that we're actually going to talk about in more detail later on in the course when we talk about the value of a statistical light. Okay, so that's basically sort of the background behind revealed preferences. And I mentioned, there's a different way that we can potentially measure the value of a non-market good, and that's known as stated preferences or contingent valuation. So stated preferences, in many ways, is more straightforward than revealed preferences. Basically, what this comes down to is you're just asking people how much they're going to pay or how much they'd be willing to pay for a specific good. So conceptually, it's sort of similar, except that we just dispense with like trying to get data on market transactions altogether, and simply just approach people and say like, hey, how much would you be willing to pay if we were to say clean up the air or something like that. So the advantage here, and it is a big advantage, is that the researcher, so you as a researcher, can construct any hypothetical scenario that you'd like. So it's not, in a lot of cases, trying to use revealed preferences. So we know, like, if you're going to use a revealed preferences methodology, you need to find some sort of market transaction that is bundling in a non-market good, like in that transaction. And depending on the non-market good you're interested in, it might be really hard to find a market transaction that essentially bundles in that good. But with contingent valuation, you can bring up any scenario you'd like. So you can always try to list somebody's preferences for willingness to pay or willingness to accept. So one would be, how much would you be willing to accept to allow drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge? Or how much would you be willing to pay to prevent a 5-degree increase in global temperatures if you're trying to estimate the potential damages of global warming? Or how much would you be willing to pay to avoid a 1 in 10,000 chance of injury? So those are just examples of hypothetical scenarios you could come up with. But again, you could come up with any scenario you want to do. So we won't do it right now, but as I said, I'm going to post a survey for you guys to take, and then you guys can do it later today or tomorrow, and I'll tabulate the results and see some things. Also, note it is not graded, so don't worry about trying to get the right answer. Just answer whatever you think is correctly reflects your own preferences, and I'll tabulate the results, and we'll discuss them later on. Okay, so you guys are going to have the advantage, though, of sort of going into this survey understanding some of the issues with contingent valuation. So it's not always the case that sometimes I give a survey before we actually talk about contingent valuation at all, and then sometimes I give it after. And I guess we could try, in theory, comparing how people's preferences change, or how they're not preferences, but like the answers they change, or answers they give change based on how informed they are about the contingent valuation method. I will say that the survey, just by chance, like it was developed before a major event that was relevant to the survey, and so I had some like pre-event results, and then the event happened, and it should probably clear you what the event was when you take the survey. And you could really see people's answers change dramatically in the survey after the event happened. And I think now probably it'll be returning, like the answers you'll give will sort of be returning back towards the pre-event means. But that's just my hypothesis, and we'll see in the.
Is there an inherent difference between willingness to pay and willingness to accept, like asking a question? Because if you were to ask people, "I pay $5 for you not to drill like next door," they say, "Yeah," but you would say, "I pay you $5 on it."
Yeah, so there is a huge difference. I mean, so that's one thing that I expect will come out in the survey is that whether or not I frame it as willingness to pay versus willingness to accept is going to have a substantial difference in terms of people's answers. And I think there's sort of two reasons for that. So one is there is a pure economic, neoclassical economic theory reason, which is that essentially depending on how valuable the right that we're thinking of assigning is, you could actually be changing people's wealth. So if it's just something little like if I say how much would you be willing to pay to I don't know, like how much would you be willing to pay to not have or let's say, like, how much would you be willing to pay to get chauffeured to your next class as opposed to having to walk there doing that's kind of like a warranted, right? So that's something where you probably wouldn't be willing to pay all that much, but you might be willing to pay a little bit. Or I could say, well, I'm going to chauffeur you unless you don't want me to, or like, I'm going to chauffeur you, but it costs me money. So I would also say, okay, like, how much would you be willing to accept to not get chauffeured to your next class? Right? So that's something that would be like a very small portion of even your like yearly income, let alone your lifetime wealth. So in theory, the amounts should be pretty similar depending on which way, whether we're measuring willingness to pay versus willingness to accept. But if you get into scenarios where it's like, how much would you be willing to pay to like open up like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to or to not open it up to drilling, versus if I said you have the right to stop drilling and how much would I have to pay you to not exercise that right, so that then it's like willingness to accept. Like if you care a lot about the National Wildlife Refuge, then that assignment of the right to like the assignment to either the oil company has the right and you need to pay to stop it versus you have the right and they need to pay you to get in there, that could actually have a pretty substantial effect on your answer, just in the sense that like in the one case, so if you like really care about it a lot, but you don't have a high income, then there's nothing you can do to stop it just because your income is limited. Whereas after we assign it to you, in particular, like you didn't have a very high marginal utility of additional dollars, then you could sit there and demand however many millions or billions. I mean, if you just had the right yourself, also, regardless of whether or not you cared about the wildlife refuge, you would still demand like billions of dollars. That's probably the value of the wildlife. Yeah. So, and in particular, like, once you start thinking about like if you were to assign that right to an environmental group versus like the environmental group has to buy the right. So like the environmental group, if they have to buy it, so they're going to just be limited by like the amount of donations they can raise, right? Whereas if they're assigned the right, like they would probably say that they wouldn't sell out at any price. That doesn't make a lot of sense because like there should always be some price, where it's like once they get offered $1 trillion, think of all like they could buy up the entire Amazon or something like that, and set that aside to. But they might still feel like, well, just for sort of like moral purposes, they couldn't actually. So that would be a case where there would actually be a fundamental economic reason why willingness to accept and willingness to pay should diverge substantially. And I guess the way you want to think about it in sort of a neoclassical framework is like you're giving a right that has potentially a lot of value to one party or the other, and whichever party receives that right, their preferences are going to be or their preferences will basically be greater, or there will be greater expression of their preferences relative to the other party, just because that party becomes wealthier and can afford to express their preferences. So that's the economic. Now, having said, there's also a psychological reason, I think, which is the sort of like loss aversion thing, right? Of just like, even if you're talking about relatively small amounts, sort of people are less willing to lose $5. Like the idea of losing $5 for a lot of people will sort of seem like it's a greater change in utility than gaining $5, even though in theory, like $5 is basically insignificant in terms of your expected lifetime wealth. So there's not like a good neoclassical economic reason why people should be more averse to a loss of the same dollar amount as a gain of the same dollar amount. But just like I think empirically, it does happen to be the case. It does look like that's true. So that again would tend to drive willingness to pay amounts to be lower than willingness to accept amounts, because willingness to pay is like a loss and willingness to accept is like a gain. Okay, so the problem with contingent evaluation is that a respondent might not essentially put their money where their mouth is. So essentially what we don't know, because we're not observing an actual market transaction, what we don't know is whether or not respondents would really make the choices that they claim to make. And this is probably something that I think we'll probably see in the survey results too, but that's just my guess. We'll see. So there are really three types of biases that there are three primary types of biases that can cause this to happen, which is to say that could cause respondents to claim that they would make a choice that faced with like faced with a scenario where they actually had to engage in that transaction with real money, they would not end up making that same choice. So the first one is what's known, or we refer to as strategic bias. So basically, the idea here is you might misreport to advance your own agenda. So like the idea, so if you want to think about this in sort of a less abstract and more concrete way, you could think of like a scenario where we're going around and saying like let's say that we're thinking of setting a cap on like carbon emissions or something, right? And so we want to figure out what cap that we should set, what the cap we should set is, and in order to figure out what a good cap is, we need to know how much people value not having climate change, right? So how much like would you be willing to pay to avoid climate change? And so we draw a random sample of U.S. households and decide to go around and survey them about their willingness to pay to avoid climate change. And so we show up your door and we're going to ask you about like, well, how much would you be willing to pay to avoid climate change? And maybe you have pretty strong environmental preferences, so you'd be willing to pay a not insignificant amount, but you also understand what's going on, and you understand we're doing this like contingent evaluation stated preferences survey in order to try to figure out where we should set the cap. And so you figure out, like, what, even if I'd be willing to pay, like, say, $1,000 to avoid climate change, I should just go ahead and say I'll pay, like, $100,000. Because I know I'm not actually going to be forced to pay that. And I also know that there's lots of people out there who don't even believe in climate change and are going to, report $0 or whatever. And so I need to, like, offset those people and try to essentially, like, manipulate the survey to strategically get towards the level of carbon emission reductions that I would personally like to have. So if if you kind of understand what's going on and you're reasonably savvy about this, and you, of course, understand you're not actually going to be forced to pay whatever you answer, then you could strategically misreport in order to advance your own agenda. The second issue that often comes up is framing bias. So just how you word the question can affect the answer. So one like really simple example would be, say that we're asking about your willingness to pay for a particular environmental good, and usually what people don't do is just say like, how much would you be willing to pay? Just have a blank space where you write in a dollar amount. So that's not how it works in general. Usually you sort of like have lots of different amounts that people can choose among, and you ask them, like what amount of these amounts representing, what amount would you choose? And so in that case, whether you say started at $0 versus started at $50 could have an impact on how people answer the question. So how you're sort of framing that choice. So obviously, if you're going to choose something that was less than 50, then starting at 50 versus starting at 0 is going to make a difference. But maybe less obviously, even if you were going to say choose something that was above $50, it still might matter where you started, just in terms of like, if the minimum is $50, you might feel like, oh well, I definitely need to do more than the minimum, so I'll choose like $100. Whereas if the minimum is 0, you might say like, well, I think $50 is an okay choice. So just where you start, just where you sort of started the choices could have an impact on the answers that people give. And then finally, there's an information bias potentially. So in some cases, respondents simply might not even comprehend the questions, and that's not. So it's also true, when faced with a real transaction, of course, people make mistakes. They don't necessarily understand all the attributes of the good that they're buying, or they have imperfect information, or they even just make like an arithmetic mistake when thinking about how much should they pay for a given good or service. But at least when they're actually making a market transaction, they know they have real money on the line, and so you have an incentive to at least try to figure out the transaction and try to make the right choice. With a stated preferences survey, if you don't really understand the question, you might say like, whatever, I'll just circle this one because I know I don't actually have any money on the line here. Yep. So that certainly makes a difference in the answers you get, but it's not necessarily a bias. It depends on like so if you're trying to estimate the value for say the entire U.S. population, then what you would want to do is make sure that you had taken a representative sample of the U.S. population. So you definitely want some poor neighborhoods in there because obviously there are poor neighborhoods in the U.S. You also want some students in there. You just wouldn't want those groups to be like under or overrepresented relative to their frequency in the population. So yeah. The other thing with the information bias is just like also a lot of times we're asking sort of like abstract questions about like say air pollution levels or something. People don't. If I say, well, we're going to change ozone levels from X parts per billion to Y parts per million to like Y parts per million, people don't have a good sense of what that means. So that question is not a particularly meaningful question, I think, for most people. What you would do in practice there is you probably like show them different pictures of different levels of air pollution in the city, and then say like, how much would you be willing to pay per day to move from the more polluted picture to the less polluted picture. So for these reasons, we are going to focus primarily on revealed preferences studies when we look at some of the actual research papers on these types of questions in the course. But you should certainly be aware of the state preferences studies as well. Okay, so I will post the survey later today, and we'll meet again Friday.